It was getting dark, the kind of darkness that creeps in slowly, almost unnoticed, until it envelops everything. My gas gauge was broken, a nuisance I kept meaning to fix but never got around to. It was one of those small problems that seemed insignificant until it wasn't. Now, it was a serious problem. My car sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. Silence. I was stranded on a deserted road miles from the nearest town with no cell service and no one in sight. The only sign of life was a distant, ominous hill topped with a solitary house, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. With a sigh, I grabbed my jacket and started walking, hoping to find help or at least some shelter for the night. The wind howled through the trees, an eerie symphony that sent shivers down my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The house loomed larger with each step, its silhouette a jagged claw against the fading light, growing more menacing as I approached. As I approached, the full scale of the house became apparent. It was enormous, towering over the landscape like a forgotten relic. It was a Victorian mansion, once grand, now crumbling and forgotten, a ghost of its former self. Paint peeled from the walls like scabs, and the windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out into the night, giving the house an eerie, haunted look. I walked up the creaking steps to the front door, each step echoing in the stillness, the sound amplifying the sense of isolation. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the wood, the sound sharp in the quiet. There was no answer, just the echo of my knock fading into the night. I tried the doorknob on a whim, not really expecting it to turn. It turned with a groan, and the door creaked open, revealing a dusty and dimly lit foyer. The air inside was stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Cobwebs draped the furniture like ghostly shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. My heart pounded. Was anyone home? The silence was almost deafening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. The emptiness seemed to swallow my words. Only the sound of my own breathing answered. I cautiously stepped inside, my shoes crunching on the grit-covered floor. To my right, a grand staircase climbed into darkness, its banister covered in a thick layer of dust. It seemed to beckon me, daring me to explore further. Straight ahead, a hallway disappeared into the shadows, its end lost in darkness. "Is anyone here?" I called out again, my voice a bit louder this time, hoping for any sign of life. Still, there was no response. The house remained eerily silent. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creaking of the house itself. It felt as if the house was alive, watching my every move. Suddenly I heard a noise from the back of the house, a shuffling sound like footsteps. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone after all. I followed the sound, my hand trailing along the wall for guidance. In the dimly lit kitchen, I found him. A man, stooped with age, stood by the window. He turned, his face etched with wrinkles, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Help you?" he asked, his voice raspy like dry leaves rustling. I explained my predicament, my words tumbling over each other in my haste. He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving my face. When I was finished, he simply nodded. "You can use the telephone," he said, gesturing to a dusty rotary phone on the wall, "but be gone by morning." The old man provided me with a meager meal and showed me to a small, dusty room upstairs. He left me with a warning, "Don't wander about the house at night." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows sent shivers down my spine. Then the noises started, low murmurs, shuffling footsteps, and a rhythmic chanting coming from somewhere below. Curiosity warred with fear. What was going on in this house? I couldn't stay in my room, not with those unsettling sounds reaching me. Against my better judgment, I crept out of bed and followed the noises. They led me down the creaking staircase and to a door hidden beneath the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver up my spine. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and peered inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The basement was illuminated by flickering candlelight, revealing a scene that sent chills down my spine. Shadows danced on the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of incense, and strange symbols were drawn on the floor in what looked like blood. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. In the center of the room, a group of figures cloaked in dark robes stood around a makeshift altar, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Their voices echoed off the walls, adding to the sense of dread. They hadn't noticed me yet, and I hoped to keep it that way. I watched in horror as one of the figures, the tallest of the group, raised a ceremonial dagger into the air, its blade glinting in the candlelight. The chanting reached a fever pitch, their voices growing louder and more frenzied. I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. My survival instincts kicked in and I turned to flee. I turned to run, my heart pounding in my ears. As I did, my foot caught on a loose floorboard and I stumbled, crying out. The chanting ceased. The figures turned towards me, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. I scrambled back, fear lending me a burst of adrenaline. I fled back through the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I haven't been back to that house since, but the memory of that night, the chanting, the symbols, the hooded figures continues to haunt me. What was their purpose? What were they about to do? The questions linger, a cold dread clinging to me like a shroud. Some secrets I've learned are better left buried. Applewood was a quiet town, the kind of place where everybody knew your name. Joe Miller's auto repair shop had been a fixture on Main Street for over 30 years. Joe was a man of simple routines. He'd open up shop at 7 a.m. sharp, the smell of motor oil and coffee greeting him like an old friend. Days were filled with the clang of tools and the murmur of the local radio station. He was a man of habit, a man of routine, a man who knew his world like the back of his hand. Evenings were for cleaning up and prepping for the next day. He'd lock up at 6 p.m., a wave to Old Man Henderson at the bakery across the street, his final act before heading home. But that routine, that comfortable predictability, was about to be shaken. The man was older, maybe in his late 60s, with tired eyes and a worn leather jacket. He walked slowly, like each step was a burden. He didn't look familiar, which was unusual in a town like Applewood. "Evening," the man said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in a while. "My car's acting up. Wondered if you could take a look." Now Joe had a soft spot for folks in need. He also knew better than to take on new work this late in the day. But there was something about the man, a quiet desperation that made Joe agree to at least take a look. The car was a nondescript sedan, dark blue, a few years old. It sat silently in the fading light like it was holding its breath. The man handed Joe the keys. "It just died on me a couple of miles back," he explained. "Couldn't get it started again." Joe noticed the man didn't seem surprised or even particularly bothered by the car's sudden failure. It was as if he expected it. He paid the initial fee, said he'd be back in the morning, and walked away without another word. Joe watched him go, a strange unease settling in his gut. Joe popped the hood of the sedan and started his inspection. He checked the battery, the spark plugs, the usual suspects. Everything seemed to be in order. He tried starting the car, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the car itself was refusing to cooperate. He was about to call it a night when the strangest thing happened. The car started, on its own. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the quiet garage. Joe jumped back, startled. He checked the ignition, the key was still in his pocket. He tried to turn the engine off, but the key wouldn't budge in the ignition. The car was running smoothly, but Joe felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the car had a mind of its own. He finally managed to stall the engine by putting the car in gear. He disconnected the battery, just to be safe. As he locked up for the night, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Joe arrived at the garage, his mind still preoccupied with the strange car. He was eager to speak with the owner, to get to the bottom of the mystery. But when he unlocked the garage, his blood ran cold. The car was gone. He checked the lock, the windows, the back door. There was no sign of forced entry. It was as if the car had simply vanished into thin air. Joe called the owner's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried calling a few more times throughout the day, but there was no answer. Hours turned into a full day, and still no sign of the owner or the mysterious car. The more Joe thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. 2 days later, a woman walked into Joe's garage. She was younger than the man from the other night, her face etched with grief. She showed Joe a picture, a man's face, worn but kind. It was the owner of the mysterious car. "This is my husband John," she said, her voice trembling. "He passed away 2 nights ago." Joe's blood ran cold. He stammered, trying to explain about the car, about the strange events of that evening. The woman listened patiently, her eyes filled with a sorrow that went beyond words. She explained that John had been battling an illness, and had been in and out of consciousness in his final days. He kept talking about needing to get his car fixed, she said, but it didn't make sense. His car was parked right outside our house. Joe's mind raced. If the man in the shop wasn't John, then who was he? And how did the car end up back at John's house? The police were called. They were initially skeptical, but the woman's grief was undeniable, and Joe's account, though strange, had the ring of truth to it. They searched John's house but found no sign of the car keys or any indication that he had driven anywhere that night. Just when the mystery seemed to deepen, they got a break. A patrol car spotted the missing sedan abandoned a few blocks from Joe's garage. The car was empty, the engine cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of what happened or who had driven it there. The police dusted for fingerprints, but the only prints they found belonged to Joe and John. They checked traffic cameras, but the car seemed to have materialized out of thin air. The investigation hit a dead end. The mystery of the car drop-off remained unsolved. The police eventually closed the case, chalking it up to a case of mistaken identity and an unexplained disappearance. But Joe couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to the story. Who was the man who brought in the car? How did the car start on its own? And how did it end up abandoned just a few blocks away? These questions haunted him, a constant reminder of the strange and inexplicable events of that week. Life in Applewood eventually returned to normal. The rhythm of Joe's days fell back into its familiar pattern. But the memory of the mysterious car and its equally mysterious driver lingered. It became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered over cups of coffee at the diner. And Joe, forever changed by the experience, looked at the world with new eyes, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in plain sight. He knew one thing for sure. Some mysteries, like the car that vanished into the night, are destined to remain unsolved, their secrets carried away on the wind.
My life was simple. I was a 22-year-old college student. My days were filled with classes, studying and hanging out with friends. It was a Friday afternoon when my car started making a strange noise. It was a sputtering sound, like the engine was struggling to breathe. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to know that something was wrong. I drove straight to the nearest mechanic shop. It was a small, dingy place on the outskirts of town. The sign outside was faded and barely visible. I parked my car and walked inside, hoping for the best, but bracing myself for the worst. The air inside smelled strongly of oil and gasoline. A greasy mechanic with a bored expression was sitting behind the counter, reading a newspaper. "Can I help you?" he asked, without looking up from his paper. "My car's making a funny noise," I said. "I think it might be the engine." The mechanic finally looked up at me. He had a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. He grunted and put down his newspaper. "Let's take a look," he said. He grabbed his toolbox and followed me outside. "I'm Robert, by the way," he said as we walked towards my car. "I'm Priya," I replied. Robert spent the next hour examining my car. He was thorough and efficient, checking everything from the engine to the brakes. Finally, he stood up and wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "It's your fuel pump," he said. "It's going to need to be replaced." My heart sank. A new fuel pump? I knew that wasn't going to be cheap. "How much will it cost?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Parts and labour, about 15,000 rupees, Robert said. I winced. That was more than I could afford right now. "Okay," I said. "When can you do it?" "I can probably fit it in tomorrow morning," Robert said. "Bring it in around 9 a.m. I thanked Robert and went back inside the shop to pay. As I was filling out the paperwork, Robert started asking me personal questions. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Oh, not too far from here," I replied, feeling a bit uncomfortable. "Do you live alone?" he pressed. I have roommates," I said, trying to end the conversation. Robert didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He kept asking me questions about my life, about my studies, about my family. I answered his questions as politely as I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about the way he was looking at me that made me feel uneasy. I left the mechanic shop feeling rattled. I decided to call my friend Ria and see if I could crash at her place for the night. I didn't want to be alone tonight. Ria lived on the other side of town, so I turned left instead of right when I left the mechanic shop. As I was driving, I saw a truck in my rearview mirror. It was Robert's truck. I could tell because of the dented bumper and the faded paint. My heart started to race. Why was he following me? I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was going in the same direction, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sped up, hoping to lose him. I stayed at Ria's place that night. I didn't tell her about Robert. I didn't want to worry her. The next morning I went back to the mechanic shop to pick up my car. Robert had fixed it, and it was running smoothly. I paid him and left as quickly as I could. That night, I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I saw something that made my blood run cold. 2 headlights appeared in my bedroom window. It was a car parked outside, its headlights shining directly into my room. I jumped out of bed and peered out the window. It was Robert's truck. He was just sitting there in his truck watching my house. I immediately called the police. They arrived a few minutes later, but by the time they got there, Robert was gone. I told the police everything about Robert, about the strange questions, about the way he was following me, about how he had parked outside my house. The police listened patiently, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said there was nothing they could do unless Robert actually hurt me. They suggested I install security cameras and try to avoid him. I felt helpless. The police wouldn't help me. I was on my own. The next day, a package arrived for me. It was a small, plain box with no return address. I hesitated before opening it. What if it was from Robert? What if it was a bomb? I took a deep breath and carefully opened the box. Inside, I found a small pink keychain. It looked harmless enough, but when I turned it over, I saw that it had a tiny camera lens hidden inside. My blood ran cold. Robert had been watching me. He had been recording me. Enclosed with the keychain was a note. It was from Robert. He apologized for scaring me. He said he was just a lonely guy who made a mistake. He begged me not to go to the police. He said he would never hurt me. He just wanted to be friends. I went to the police station the next day and showed them the keychain and the note. They finally took me seriously. They went to Robert's shop and arrested him. It turned out that he had a history of stalking women. He had been arrested several times before, but he had always been released due to lack of evidence. This time I had the evidence. Robert was charged with stalking and harassment. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Looking back on that time, I am grateful that I was able to escape Robert's clutches, but the experience left me shaken and scarred. I learned the hard way that you can never be too careful. You never know who is out there, watching you, waiting for their chance to strike. I learned that even the most ordinary seeming people can be dangerous, and I learned that sometimes the only person you can rely on is yourself. If you are being stalked or harassed, please know that you are not alone. There are people who can help you. Reach out to a trusted friend or family member, or contact a local support organisation. You don't have to go through this alone.